would like to introduce our presenters for today. We have Michal Patel, Head of Imaging, AI, and Data Analytics at AstraZeneca, and Chris Crabtree, Associate Principal, ZS. Welcome, gentlemen. The webinar is yours.
Thank you very much. And I've been having technical issues myself, so you'll probably just see the side of my face because my camera decided to turn off on my screen, so do forgive me. But good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone. So artificial intelligence, or AI, as it's most commonly referred to, it's definitely one of industry's top buzzwords, and it's grabbing a lot of headlines and attention. And this is probably where I should make a confession and tell you that we just put AI in the title to attract more people to this meeting. But actually, we're going to be talking about unicorns for the rest of the next 45 minutes. Obviously, I'm joking about that. But a common question that I get given or get asked is AI real or is it just a hype? And, there's a lot of investment in it. And, I do believe that it's here to stay. And I'm not just saying that because I have AI in my job title. Just from working within the pharmaceutical industry and being within this industry for a while, AI is adopted to aid decision-making across the entire pharma value chain, from commercial strategy, supply and manufacturing, and R&D. However, for it to become a long-term sustainable part of any business, it does need to mature, especially in the way we manage our portfolio of projects. And so today, in this presentation, we're going to focus on the current state of AI in R&D in particular, explore what makes it very different to applications in other functional areas, and then talk about what we need to do differently to realize its true potential. So if we move on to the next slide, please, Chris. So just to briefly introduce myself, my name's Michal. I head up the Imaging, AI, and Data Analytics within our clinical pharmacology and safety sciences function at AstraZeneca. And I've worked in the field of applying advanced analytics to healthcare problems for the majority of my career, ranging from early drug discovery, late-stage clinical trials, as well as the clinic. And my passion and what gets me out of bed is about trying to use AI algorithms, data science methods to accelerate drug development.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. Thanks to those of you who persevered through the technical difficulties at the start. I'm Chris. I'm an associate principal in the London office of ZS. ZS is a professional services firm supporting the life sciences industry from R&D through to commercialization. My work focuses more in the area of R&D and bridges between consulting, technology, and advanced analytics. And I've got a particular interest in, I'd say, the people side of AI, how we build teams, how we set the strategy around that, how we ultimately deliver value to the business. Great, so let's kick on. Just to set the scene, I guess, first of all, so many of this audience will be aware that, pharma productivity is shrinking. Deloitte have famously calculated an ROI of 1.8% for large cap pharma R&D over the last 10 years. And in fact, some have estimated the returns could even turn negative by 2025. And yet, as you can see on the left-hand chart, R&D spend continues to increase. So this decline in productivity is, we would argue, perhaps the most important challenge the industry faces right now. After all, who's going to invest in those kind of returns? And so improving that productivity is probably the industry's most important priority. And quite a lot of the focus these days is on increasing the efficiency of the clinical development process. For example, accelerating clinical trials is an important topic for many people in the scope audience. But this alone isn't going to suffice. Truly significant improvements in R&D productivity, we believe, are going to require some quite fundamental changes to the early R&D processes of drug discovery and early clinical development, from target selection through to clinical proof of concept. So let's turn to AI. Now, with the potential to automate processes, increase efficiency, enable better, more data-driven decisions, AI and machine learning have large parts to play in really addressing this declining ROI topic. As you can see from the left, AI investments are on the rise. The market's growing pretty rapidly, and big pharma are all moving in this direction. So they're securing AI-driven deals, investing heavily to build their teams of data scientists and big data practitioners. I think many would argue that AI is still quite early in the hype cycle, but yet the risk of failing to participate is much too big for any farmer to stay away right now. So some companies like Novartis are very publicly positioning themselves as going big on AI. Many others are more quietly placing their bets and securing focused deals. And of course, there's obviously the looming threat of market disruption from the Googles and Amazons of the world. On this chart, we can see some of the recent AI-related activities. And you can see Novartis right at the top there. Perhaps not surprising given Vas's public strategy of really being a data science company. But I think it's also noteworthy that AstraZeneca is up there as well. Maybe, Michelle, you can comment a little bit on the AstraZeneca position here.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose we're taking a holistic approach. The aim is to embed data science and AI across R&D. And we use AI to help us to analyze and interpret huge quantities of data at all stages of drug discovery and drug development. And the aim is to gain a better understanding of diseases, which we want to treat, identify new targets for novel medicines, recruit for and design better clinical trials, speeding up the way we design and develop to make new drugs and driving personalized medicine strategies. But it's important to point out that this, we can't do this on our own, and we don't want to do this on our own. So we do look to partner and collaborate with innovative companies, academic groups and centres, as well as building and developing our own teams internally. So it is nice to see us from this lens high up on this chart.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. So what's the current state of AI in pharma R&D? So estimated spend on AI, as you can see on the left, ranges around $150 million per year for big pharma. But as you can see from the charts, a large proportion of this sits in very early stage projects. So it's quite a long time to value realization. So you can see in the left chart there that 90% of the work is 3 or more years away from realizing value. So having a concentration of such projects in really early stages with the long lead time to impact makes these R&D portfolio of AI and data science projects inherently risky. So you got to ask, do people actively manage their AI portfolio risk? And from what we've seen, typically not. And yet, for AI to be a sustainable, long-term value-generating part of the business, we believe that ongoing careful project and portfolio management are going to be needed, and that includes the management of risk. So broadly speaking, we can think of AI investments in 2 main categories. One is about process automation, streamlining manual efforts. So for example, automating an imaging analytics pipeline from image capture through to insights. The other is more about truly novel value-generating activities, such as perhaps predicting disease progression in patients. And so for the remainder of this presentation, we're going to focus more on that latter category. Great. So back to Michelle.
Okay, perfect. So, let's just take a step back, actually, because we have people from different backgrounds on this call. So let's just think about what I mean when I say a role of a data scientist. So in this kind of context, the data scientists in general are interested in extracting insights or finding patterns from data with a view to making predictions and taking actions which have ultimately a business impact. I just wanted to kind of put that context in there. So if you look on the left-hand side, what we are showing here is what I'd call a very simplified but a typical approach when it comes to a data science project. And it's shown linearly. Now, reality is that there's obviously an iterative process, and this is, as I said, a simple approach. But here, a project starts with some initial ideas, some data exploration to determine the feasibility of an approach. So, for example, I want to identify a novel biomarker for treatment response. And I check that I have suitable data, whether it's internal or external, which can actually support that question. I next build my initial model and I refine it to improve its accuracy and predictive power. And all being well, the model is performing well, so I should be able to move ahead and scale up and start applying the algorithm in the real-world setting, knowing that it's adding value over and above manual or human interventions. And in general, such projects are evaluated right at the beginning against an assumed realization of business value. So this will be from the get-go measured, by a range of metrics, or KPIs such as NPV or capability development. And so the challenge you have is if you only focus on these types of metrics, it can actually lead to a situation where high risk or innovative projects may not end up getting considered in your portfolio. And being innovative is really important, especially if you want to push the boundaries of science and deliver life-changing medicine. So, we need to think about how we can actually, as Chris was saying earlier, kind of think about our risk and manage our risk to ensure we do have innovative projects as well as the standard projects within your data science portfolio. But moreover, only focusing on business value or capability development doesn't consider the nuances in R&D data science projects, which in many instances are experimental in nature. So if we move on to the next slide. So, I'm talking about what my passion is about, industrializing AI, data science within life science R&D. And when you're looking at it under that scene, we need to think differently to the way you would in a commercial or an operational setting. You have to manage your portfolio differently, and you need to measure value differently. So why is that? Well, firstly, the focus is not just on accuracy. It's more on building understanding and appropriate interpretation of how the model came to its conclusion. So while in many domains, areas where an AI black box could just, works well, and it just needs to have a high accuracy, in the kind of field where I'm applying these types of methods, there's important aspects of trust, adoption, that can drive towards less powerful but more explainable solutions. And it's working out what that balance needs to be. Moreover, in many cases, in my experience, the project lifecycle tends to be a lengthy one. You'd have multiple rounds of iterations with scientists and clinicians. You're testing and validating on different data sets, some of which may actually be time-consuming to obtain. And the impact can also be measured quite differently. The results of even a failed project can provide invaluable insights that can advance the understanding of disease. So it's important to consider a much broader definition of value than purely the accuracy of the modeling development. And finally, modeling and feature selection typically needs to be founded on a solid understanding of science. This isn't a Kaggle competition, so we're not just trying to optimize for accuracy. So, a good example is even if I build a model which is showing great results and I go and present it to my stakeholders, or more likely people in my team present it to stakeholders, 9 out of 10 times the question we'll get is, so how does this relate back to the biological mechanism? And in many instances, if you have a model which is giving empirical findings, biomarker X goes up, clinical variable B goes Y by this much, and this gives us a prediction, you're not able to do that. So you need to be thinking about the science and trying to relate this back to the underlying biological mechanisms. And this is what makes it a much more challenging to actually get value and to also progress projects within the context of R&D. If we move on to the next slide. So in summary, given this environment of R&D, a different approach needs to be adopted to evaluate a data science project and by extension their portfolio. And it's important to, as a leader, to think about the portfolio as well. And the goal that I want to have is to have a healthy, balanced portfolio of projects, which should be evaluated very similar to other investments in the organization. So and when you look into this, most companies will use similar criteria for evaluating projects in general. So it could be NPV, expected rewards, cost, time to realization, or feasibility to deliver. The problem with some of these metrics is it seems all projects will go to full-scale production, and hence does not value insights generated in the process. And that's a bit of a miss, actually. It's not just a destination, but it's also the journey that provides value. Secondly, costs can often be undermined as efforts and estimates are commonly revised during the project. I seldom see someone who comes with an initial estimate for a data science project and the project actually is delivered on time. And so there's a little bit here about training to ensure that we can actually learn from previous projects to ensure we estimate correctly. But your metrics at the beginning need to be revised as you go along. Otherwise, you end up with incorrect metrics. And a healthy portfolio should strike the right balance between exploration and exploitation. And there is no magic formula for the right balance of exploration versus exploitation when it comes to realized value. So exploration is about tackling new problems and bringing bold new ideas, while exploitation is about innovating on existing ideas to bring efficiencies and incremental gains. In many ways, this boils down to the risk appetite of the organization and the expectations of the leadership and how this is aligned to the overarching business strategy or your portfolio strategy. And it's important to kind of get this aligned early on to ensure we arrive at the right project mix rather than defending our project choices. And you can mitigate some of these risks by actually doing simple things like rewarding failing fast. So people always talk about failing fast, but actually how often do you reward people for failing fast? Sounds a bit counterintuitive, but if you have a moonshot, an innovative project, we want to get to a point as quickly where we know if we need to progress that. And for me, that's a huge success. If you turn around and go, actually, we shouldn't continue this because you've just saved yourself a lot of agony and a lot of resources. Moreover, I think actually a healthy portfolio, one of the key metrics you should kind of have on here is how many projects do you as a leadership team or a management group looking after a portfolio stop early? How many projects do you actually take that bold decision to say, we're going to stop this because it doesn't fit with our strategy, or we feel that it's not going to yield the results, and have those concrete, justifiable metrics alongside that. Over to you, Chris. You can take the next one.
Great, thanks, Prashant. So, given what we've just been saying, what's our suggestion? So, what we want to talk you through is a framework. So, we're proposing a framework here that has 4 phases of development, if you like, that mirror quite closely the drug development process. In this slide, you can see the phases of the data science project at the bottom, and in comparison with the drug development process at the top. So phase 0, you've got your early ideas. Perhaps it's triggered by a business question you received, perhaps some first feasibility work to see if you've got the data that you need. Into phase 1, we get into our modeling. So we're working with a data set. This could be fairly iterative, but it gives us a good first feel on the viability of the effort. You can see the parallels here, perhaps with phase 1 clinical studies. Phase 2, we're getting into validation and generalizability. So really about proving the model works with other data sets, proving it works in a broader population, and getting ready for scale. And then finally in phase 3 on the right, getting into scaling up the solution, embedding it into, if you like, business as usual. And as with clinical development, this is where a lot of the costs sit. So this phased approach carries with it a number of useful features. So firstly, I think this is really important. It helps us better understand the steps that are required from the very initial ideas all the way through to model development and validation and finally to scale. In our experience, this is a really powerful tool for communicating with your internal stakeholders. Now, these folks may be very familiar with the drug development process, but very unfamiliar with the data science process. And so being able to communicate the steps that you're going through is really important. After all, the success of your AI projects in R&D is going to be very heavily reliant on how you manage the expectations of leadership and other collaborators in the organization. Second, breaking down the process into these steps gives us much greater transparency into progress at the project level. So in turn, this gives you much greater clarity at the portfolio level. So how many projects do you have at each stage? How's the portfolio mix evolving over time? So these are important topics, and we'll come on a little bit later to talk about this portfolio thinking. Next, if we start to layer on some additional information, you can start to see how the presence of stages and gates allows us to better understand how a project is creating value, and importantly, how and when a project might need to be stopped or killed. So this concept of stopping a project, just as Michelle was saying, is a pretty fundamental one. And again, probably quite familiar from the drug development process. So once we visualize projects like this, we can much more easily see that it's not an all or nothing game. Often it makes sense to stop a project before phase 2. Perhaps the organization's priorities have shifted, perhaps there's a lack of stakeholder buy-in, or perhaps the overall portfolio mix is now dictating that we should focus on higher priority projects for a time. And yet, we've still generated value. Perhaps an insight from phase 1 can feed into a different project. Perhaps it advances our disease understanding. Maybe it leads to a journal publication. And it may also lead to the development of new capabilities that the team can apply to other projects. So not every project needs to progress to phase 3 to be valuable. Now, the framework also helps us plan ahead for what's needed for success at each stage. We can better see where and when the larger investments are going to be required, where we should be thinking about infrastructure or change management, where to bring in additional skills or support to help the projects progress. So having these discrete steps helps us better manage payoffs and risks. It provides us our stopping criteria and different measures of success at each stage. And now this helps us evolve our thinking of how we measure the attractiveness of a project from a very simple payout at the end through to a more sophisticated decision tree, with multiple branches, intermediate payouts. And again, if you think about mirroring the drug development process and the portfolio analysis that's done by large pharma companies, this then starts to give you a lot greater sensitivity and granularity to manage the overall portfolio mix. So you can make better decisions about when to pause, stop, or accelerate projects as part of the overall portfolio balance and the overall portfolio risk. Now, for early stage R&D data science experiments, the focus we think should be on the rewards. On the left, your early stage, you've got a lot of projects, and you really should be focusing on what's the potential reward or what's the opportunity cost of not doing something, as opposed to the risks. So early on, the value of insights and the value of getting an insight that supports other projects is much higher. The insight can impact different functions, support several other use cases. And then as we move down to the right, we gather more evidence, the true utility can become clearer. And so as we progress through the phases, we can become clearer on the dependencies in taking this project to scale, and our cost estimates can start to be refined. So this gives us an opportunity to more easily and financially assess the marginal value of progressing a project. So, having this kind of a framework starts to help us answer or even asks, some better questions about the project. Strategically, is this project still aligned with where our organization's trying to go? People move around in the organization, priorities shift. You've got to be able to ask that question. You can't just assume that what started out as a good project is still a good project. At the same time, you can be asking, is this opportunity still needed? Is it still real? Or actually, did we already generate insights from an earlier phase that the stakeholders are happy with? They don't need any more. And so, is this actually still the project to focus on, or should we be focusing elsewhere? And then, of course, what's our ability to be successful here? Do we have the right capabilities to progress? Or, should we actually be passing this project to some other function in the organization where they have a different skill set to manage the project? And then, of course, being able to think about this at the portfolio level, then make sure we, make the right decisions at the project level. So if you might have a project which independently and in of itself is a very good project and you think it'd be worth progressing. But what if all of your projects are in the same phase? What if your risk is skewed? Does it actually make sense to pause and focus elsewhere? And so here the concept of the marginal utility of progressing a project is quite important. And we can making sure we're thinking about portfolio balance and risk when deciding how to progress or whether to stop a project is going to be really important. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a flavor of the thinking and the framework Let me pass back to Michelle to talk us through a real life project example and try and bring it to life for us.
Sure. Okay. So let's take an example where I don't know. We want to develop an algorithm which will learn from a rich phenotype registry that also includes new biomarkers that have not been evaluated before to identify patients with a particular disease who rapidly progress. And what we want to do is we want to identify these patients so we can enroll them into a clinical trial. So normally we would identify these patients via screening, and so that you would have a biopsy, and thus this would be a non-invasive and a faster approach if we could use an algorithm to actually identify such patients. So how we could put this into practice in terms of this framework. So it sounds quite simple when I say, let's divide this into 4 phases. Yeah, start small and slowly scale up. But you'd be surprised how often people don't do this. So, if we're going to divide this into the 4 phases, and just remember, each phase could have multiple mini cycles if you wanted to. But the recommendation is we should actually plan this from the beginning. So phase 0 would be a literature review to kind of understand the current baseline and kind of get that question, what does success look like? Are there existing clinical scoring methods to identify the patients? Are there machine learning models already out in literature applied to this challenge before? What are the features they've identified? And what enhancements are we planning for? Here it would be new data and potentially new methods. And typically you'd build a charter or a work plan, and you would present this to your line manager or to your stakeholders and get a green light to progress. So at phase 1, here we're talking about applying machine learning to real world data. So we want to define our cohorts, and that will be an iterative process anyway. We're working with the clinical experts as well as the health informaticians. And then we're going to build our first model and identify key features and any data dependencies that are going to be associated with that, and compare the performance against the benchmark estimated in phase 0 at the beginning. And your kind of decision criteria here on whether you should go from phase 1 to phase 2 would obviously be, have you exceeded the current baseline standard? Does your model actually add more value than the current methods already out there? And phase 2 would be where we would validate the model using a new or independent data set. And there are actually 2 very important realizations from this step. So what is the cost of collecting the validation or production data? Do your models generalize to this new data set? And what is the cost of not having certain features? Also, you've got a different data set. It's collected in a different way. There's different levels of quality. There's also going to be noise. How do you then think about kind of making models robust to these types of drifts? And so this is why I say you need to think about this from the beginning. It's around proper planning to kind of identify some of these issues. And then finally, phase 3. At this point, we figure out how to put our model into production and the dependencies associated with this. Do we need to have HTA evaluation, FDA approval? Will we need to build partnerships with EHR providers when we're rolling this out into the real world? Do we have IT support and internal engineering capabilities? How does our tool fit into the existing workflow? And it's really critical, actually, because if you want to then have this tool as a model which turns into a mobile calculator, maybe that a physician could use to kind of identify patients, how does that fit into their workflow? If you don't know that and how they can use it, you're guaranteed for failure. So if we move on to the next slide, we're just going to kind of talk through maybe a few scenarios where these stage gates could be activated. So in this scenario, we're talking about we do our literature review, so phase 0. We identify our current benchmark, and the data. And to improve model performance, we're going to use the latest gradient boosting method coupled with our new data set with new biomarker data. And the team strongly feels that inclusion of this data will significantly affect model performance. And we're aligned on what our preferred performance metrics is, and ultimately what the goal is. So at phase 1 we build our model, and in the process we also build an encoder to engineer features from our new biomarkers. That's a new capability. However, the model fails to meet the performance goal initially estimated. There's a couple of things we could do here. We could kind of go back round and say, well, let's try another modeling method, let's tweak something, and you could do another cycle around that. But ultimately, whatever you do, you're not going to probably get to your performance metric. And so we decided to sunset the project for the time being. So while we killed the project in this phase, we were able to evaluate the latest boosting method and test whether that offers any considerable gains. And actually, we have an organizational memory of that and actually know how to use it and etc. We've built a new capability to leverage the biomarker data and derive features from it. Let's talk about the encoder. And thus, we've advanced our disease understanding that this biomarker might not be as predictive as we initially assumed. So you could actually put this into a kind of like an internal communication. And for me, far too many projects end up rolling into phase 2 in the absence of the right decision criteria. As a result, we incur additional costs without the associated outcomes. Not everything needs to go to production. But we could pause experimentation and still realize some value and insights or learning from that. So if we think about the next scenario, so if we go to the next slide, we could just pretend, let's say, that our model was great. It was fantastic and it beat the clinical scoring method and any other methods which have been published out there. And, we're able to work with this new biomarker. So that's fantastic. We're into phase 2. So we're looking to validate this model and start evaluating another real-world data set that also includes the new biomarker, which our model is heavily dependent on in performance. And actually what we realize is that the cost of collecting this data due to the additional linkages for the biomarker is actually really high. So we may need to build partnerships with providers or maybe even start a registry to be able to collect this information. This is time and resource intensive. So we decided that we'll work on the data partnerships and build this capability before the data science team picks this up again. So that's our stopping criteria here. And so maybe the outcome here is we could actually write this up as a publication and actually publish this and try and actually get the results out there and get a debate going within kind of the external community about this new biomarker. But this experience also helps us to understand the costs associated with building novel data sources and establishing partnerships with providers and academic institutions. And so it goes back to a point I was making earlier, which is here in this scenario, we've been lucky and we've identified a validation data set and we know the kind of costs that's going to be associated with that. So if we went on our previous metric around the cost savings, it'd actually be incorrect, because it's actually going to cost a lot more because we're going to have to spend maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars to actually procure and or build a new data set. So there's been quite a lot of important learnings just from actually thinking about this in this way. Over to you, Chris.
Great, thanks, Michelle. I think it's really interesting to hear Michelle talk through these things because it shows how that kind of discipline of thinking is really valuable here, and it's something we don't always see. And I think in general, if we move on, I think one of the things that we see is, it's one thing to have a framework. It's another thing to actually use it and be successful and disciplined with it. And so for many teams that we work with, this approach can be quite a challenging one. Having that disciplined thinking at the project level, but then even going beyond that and thinking at the portfolio level, that's only really possible if the teams have the right skills and the right mindsets. And so for individual team members on these kind of projects, this concept of stopping projects early, that can be a particularly difficult one. So leaders, as Michelle touched on this earlier, they need to embed this expectation early on, celebrate those fast failures and really intervene where there's signs of this kind of commitment bias taking hold and people kind of pushing something on beyond where it ought to stop. So partly that's a mindset thing, partly that's a governance and leadership thing. For leaders of these teams, bringing in this new degree of discipline to portfolio management is typically a new challenge. Perhaps they're on their game when it comes to individual projects, but they're not really thinking at the portfolio level. They're not really thinking about overall balance and the overall risk in the portfolio. And so here you need, of course, processes to be in place so that you have up-to-date information for all of your projects. And but you also need to be asking a new set of questions. Asking a new set of questions around risk and whether something should progress given the context of the broader portfolio. For new data science teams especially, we typically advise designing the team to suit the nature of the portfolio rather than the other way around. Some of the right mindset can be hired in, some needs to be fostered over time. But importantly, we see different skills being important for different projects at different phases of development. And so typically it's advisable that you build a team that's got diversity of skill sets and the ability to fill different needs at different times for different projects, rather than hunting for unicorns. It's not you're going to have a team full of people who can do everything from early feasibility through to scaling and everything in between. I think we could probably run a whole separate webinar on teams and skill sets and mindsets, but in the interest of time, I'll pause there for now. So, a few takeaways from today in summary. So we touched on, the importance of AI and its role in addressing this productivity crisis really within pharma R&D. Michelle talked about some of the nuances of data science in R&D, some of the aspects around interpretability, generalizability, the need to be building on scientific foundations. And then we talked about a new framework really to think about how you manage a project, and then from there, how that rolls up into a portfolio. So you're moving from thinking about outputs through to intermediate payouts, and moving from thinking about a collection of projects to a portfolio which has its own mix, its own risk balance, and needs to be aligned with where you want to take the organization. And then finally, we touched on the importance of establishing both the right skills and the right mindsets in the team so that some of this concepts that we've talked about is actually pulled through and there's a discipline that supports that. Great. Well, thank you very much for listening. We'll move into Q&A. I'm actually going to stop sharing so I can see the questions. All right, that's a little easier. Okay, so let me look to the first question. So a question around the overlap or coordination of statisticians and data scientists. Are they merging? What's a data analyst versus a data scientist? Are these merging? Maybe Michelle, you wanna start on that one?
Yeah, sure. So that's a good question actually. So I suppose I think about things I think about data scientists probably different to maybe some of the traditionally coined terms. So what you normally have is that Venn diagram that people show. You've got someone who's really strong with mathematics and computing and then domain expertise, and then in the middle they normally like data scientists or a unicorn. So first of all, there's no such thing as unicorns, and so we should be thinking about people like that. But also what I've noticed in my experience is it depends on the flavor of a data scientist that you would want based on your strategy as an organization or what you want to do as a team. So if you're in a hub or if you're in a spoke, for example, you have different requirements. You might need to have more weight on domain knowledge and less on the mathematics, and equal on computing. So it really depends, and you can move those weights around to kind of get what I call a different profile of a person, and that's an important thing for groups or organizations to think of. Should you have the same types of people? No, you can have different flavors or profiles of data scientists throughout. Maybe you want to add a bit more to that, Chris.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that. I think the other thing I'd add, having worked with different organizations, is there's a definition challenge. One organization's data scientist is another organization's AI specialist. So, whenever you're dealing with these terms, make sure you really understand what's intended. I think in general, particularly in the R&D setting, all data scientists need to have a pretty good understanding of statistics, but I'd say a statistician is a little bit of a different role. We do see teams where they have data scientists who are doing more what we would call sort of standard data analysis. But many of them actually joined wanting to do more AI and machine learning. So sometimes there's a bit of a mismatch between the work that's needed to be done and the sort of hopes and intentions of the team. But in general, yeah, I do see there's some merging happening, but our view is really about having a mix of skills and making sure that the team has the right mix to support the portfolio in place. Great. So another question, what insights can you share on working with external data science partners? I better hand that to Michelle.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I mean, look, we work with external partners all the time. It's actually a valuable part of our output in our business. And I suppose there's various different facets. So you can look at it in terms of, do you want surge protection? Do you want to just outsource bits of projects to an external partner? Do you got to look at it in terms of what my skill gaps are? And, we try and go to an external consultancy or external data science consultancy to plug those skill gaps. It could be on, deep learning as opposed to classical machine learning. The other way to think about this is actually what you want to foster within your department. So, you might say, well, actually, we have regular work, which is kind of, we've already established the methods and we are continually wanting to churn these analyses out. So you might want to outsource that piece by having what I call kind of an external partner team. And then you leave in a more innovative work for those who understand the business much better, know the stakeholders, etc., to really kind of work up and figure out what the project needs to be. And so it really depends on how you want to do that. In terms of how to work with them, for me, it's about being really transparent on what your expectations are. So I am always, and anyone who works with me will probably vouch for this, I'm very kind of clear on what we want. Where I see companies maybe having issues when they go external is when there's a lot of ambiguity on what their expectations are. And so it's important to kind of be quite open and lay out what you want to achieve from a particular partnership.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. Okay, so there's a question or two around the importance of transparency and explainability in AI, particularly for clinical regulatory decision-making. Just to kick off on this one, I think it's a very important topic. It's one that it really needs to actually be baked into that framework, the phasing of work and what the anticipation of what might be required. We've seen examples of where an algorithm has been built that would have theoretically intended to be used with patients, by doctors, and yet the organization has sort of too late realized that to actually be put into use, this thing would need to be classified as software as a medical device, and which requires a whole regulatory pathway from the FDA. And that's no small feat, particularly because the FDA guidance itself has been evolving quite a bit of late. And it's only really now becoming a little clearer, what are the steps required to get something through that process and into use. I think really at the heart of that is a lot about explainability, interpretability, and I think it has two aspects. One is there needs to be confidence that it's working and it's working for the right reasons. But there also needs to be confidence from the user. If this is something that a physician is expected to use perhaps to support their clinical decision-making, they need to have trust in it. And so not just for regulators, but also for users, having that those extra steps to explain, what's the biological basis for this feature having an impact, or why do we think it's having this impact, or which are the most important features in this model and for what reason. I think that's really important, as well as quite a lot of explanation around the nature of the data sets that were used to develop, train, and validate the model. Particularly as you get into things like, if you generated a model on the US population of patients and then you're trying to apply it in Europe, what's the basis for that to be true? is there a validation step in European data that we can point to? So a very important point. I think the guidance is continuing to evolve. I think the European regulators are going to probably do something very similar to the FTA, but it's a hot topic and one to keep an eye on. All right, then we have a question in the last few minutes. How does a new data science team decide where to focus? How do you pick the right use cases? Maybe I'll start, and then Michelle, you can build. I think, for us, one of the important things we see, and Michelle touched on this earlier, is the consulting skills of the team. A data science team isn't just about technical skills. It's about the ability to engage with the business. And so understanding where to focus is about engaging successfully with the business and unearthing, where are their needs and where is their value from having an AI application. So that's the starting point. I'd say on top of that, particularly in a large organization, you can also prioritize which are the business stakeholders you're going to start with. Who are the ones that are perhaps more open to the potential of AI, perhaps less skeptical ones. And then you're moving into the kind of portfolio mix questions. I have to making sure you've got a mix of use cases with both short and longer term time to value, mix of higher and lower risk, truly novel versus exploitative applications. And then I guess finally, the matching to the team skills. Given what your team looks like, the skills that they have and their ambitions, that can also shape, where you start. Michelle, anything you'd add?
I think you covered most of it there. I mean, I suppose for me, it's you get direction from your overarching strategy. So what are your business goals? And if you're in a department, what are your objectives for the year? But then there's also a piece around we'll talk about innovation. So for example, in my team, we would give people a target to publish. And so, it's also kind of thinking about those objectives as well. But matching against skills is really important because ultimately, you need to be able to execute those projects and you need to be able to deliver them on time, but also make sure that you establish that relationship with your stakeholders, that when you say you're going to deliver something and it's going to be giving you X, Y, Z, you can actually back that up. So it's making sure that you have the right skill sets to actually deliver on the promises that you make.
Right. Any other questions you've seen, Michelle, in the flow that you want to address quickly? There was
one about how this compares to kind of classical methods. So I suppose I think those are separate things. So this framework is about how you manage a portfolio and what decisions you need to make to kind of progress a project forward. When it look at managing a data science project, so something like CrispDM, I mean, that's awesome. It's a great way of actually having a framework to actually go about when you're executing a project. So you can use something like CrispDM within each of those phases. Yeah. So you can have data exploration, model building, going back to your stakeholders, and kind of doing that cycle within each of those phases. And that's what I was mentioning earlier.
Yeah. Great. So maybe just as we've only got 2 minutes left, we'll draw to a close. Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Michelle.